Years ago, I read a passage from this book that I'd like to share with you today. By means of a propaganda of books, newspaper articles, leaflets, tracts in, and he mentions 9 different languages, we have to spread this idea, repeat this idea, and impose upon this war the idea that this war must end war. When H.G. Wells penned this in 1914, the people of his time simply called it the Great War, or the war to end all wars. The hope was that this would be the last time, in fact, the only time, that the nations of this world would engage in global conflict. Today, we simply call it World War I. The war to end all wars, well, didn't. Instead, it planted the seeds for World War II, the bloodiest, deadliest war in all of human history. And now, with global tensions on the rise, more and more people are asking the question, will there be a World War III? We're going to answer that question today, but we're also going to answer another far more important question. Why? Why do humans seem bound for conflict? Why do we, despite our best efforts, seem to end in violence and bloodshed? The truth is, we humans will never be capable of achieving true, lasting peace. But God is, and He will, after one final conflict that will mark the end of this age. Curious? Stay with me today as we take a closer look at the true war that will end all wars. Let's quickly review some of the major conflicts that have occurred since the end of World War II and when they started. The Arab-Israeli War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Berlin Crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf War, the Bosnian War, the Second Congo War, the Kosovo War, the Afghanistan War after 9/11, the Iraq War, the war in Darfur, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Hamas's attack on Israel. What do all of these conflicts have in common? They all happened after the Second World War. And that's not a complete list. Uppsala University in Sweden has identified hundreds of distinct armed conflicts around the world since 1946. 2 global wars haven't put an end to the fighting. What will? Let's look at 2 scriptures that describe why we continue to have conflicts. The first is found in the book of James. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and you do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war. We see 2 very distinct causes of warfare from this scripture. The first is the lust for material gain. Now, that can be a lust for control of power, of land, of natural resources. We humans have a long history of never being satisfied with what we have. The second stems from hatred. Ethnic differences have long plagued humanity by pitting one group against another, sometimes leading to the atrocities of genocide. But more than just ethnic, this hatred can also stem from religious differences, political differences, societal values, all dividing our world into various encampments, with each side believing that theirs is the correct path forward, resulting in fighting and war. The prophet Isaiah also saw this human tendency when he declared in Isaiah chapter 59, starting in verse 8, "The way of peace they have not known, and there is no justice in their ways. They have made themselves crooked paths. Whoever takes that way shall not know peace." The absence of peace is often based on fear. Fear perhaps that their way of life is in jeopardy. Fear that their power is slipping on the global stage. Add fear of loss to the lust for control, and you have a powerful attraction to take from others in war. However, is the threat of war today even more dangerous than it's been in the past? Even though we haven't had another world war, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan said in 2001, "In some ways, the challenges are even more daunting than they were at the peak of the Cold War. Not only do we continue to face grave nuclear threats, but those threats are being compounded by new weapons development, new violence within states, and new challenges to the rule of law. Here's a list of nations with biological, chemical, nuclear, or radiological weapons at their disposal. Think back to the end of World War II and realize how many more nations have weapons of mass destruction. Add to that hypersonic missiles and drones, and humanity's capacity to wage war exceeds anything previous generations could even imagine. What would it take to trigger one of today's wars to escalate into World War III? The Bible tells us that we are living in an era of human history called last days. Prophecies show that it's an era that will culminate in a devastating global war that will pit the human race against its creator. Let me show you how we'll get from here to there. We're going to start by looking at an important prophecy in Daniel chapter 11, which introduces us to some of the key players in this final world war, the mysterious king of the north and his persistent rival, the king of the south. Now, time doesn't permit me to go through this amazing prophecy in detail, but you can read about it in our article, Daniel 11, the most detailed prophecy in the Bible. It covers the warring kings of the north and south throughout their history, culminating in the final battle at the end of this age. Let's start in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all of the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and to annihilate many. The king of the north has predominantly been the region north of the nation of Israel today, and it has often included much of Europe and the various revivals of the Roman Empire. The king of the south has consisted of what today are the Arab states. These two powers will be engulfed in a global conflict that will center around Jerusalem. The prophecy continues by detailing the worst war that will ever be waged on earth. In Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, it says, "At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time." This final battle will start as a war between nations, but it will quickly escalate. Jesus himself added important details to this prophecy in Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 4. "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." As the world goes deeper into depravity, Jesus tells us things will continue to get worse. Continue with his warning to his disciples, starting in verse 15. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Now, we'll pick up the abomination of desolation in a minute, but let's finish up with the words of Jesus Christ in verse 21 and 22. "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." Those are chilling words from our Messiah. Nations fighting nations, global disasters, a tribulation that threatens to wipe out all of humanity if Jesus didn't return and stop it. So Jesus told us to watch for something called the abomination of desolation. Well, what does that mean? And even if we know what it is, how are we supposed to watch for it? Actually, there had already been one abomination of desolation before Jesus spoke those words. And the context of that event can help us spot the next one. Let's return to Daniel chapter 11 and pick up the storyline. Daniel chapter 11, verses 29 through 31, describes the actions taken by an earlier king of the north. At the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved, and return in rage against the holy covenant, and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices, and place there the abomination of desolations. The context of verses 21 through 34 document the tyrannical oppression of the Jewish people by Antiochus Epiphanes, who by force tried to make the Jewish people forgo their religion in favor of all things Greek. This was the time of the Maccabees, who resisted this Hellenistic influence. Bo Reek, in his book, The New Testament Era, writes, "In Antiochus Epiphanes, they saw the worst tyrant of history. Antiochus borrowed the surname Epiphanes, manifest, to indicate that he was a manifestation of the deity. Strongly reinforcing a tradition of the Seleucids, he required men to worship him as Olympian Zeus. He set up a statue to Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem and sacrificed a pig on the altar, thus defiling it. He then banned the Jewish religion and actively persecuted those who refused to comply. This happened after Daniel's time, but before Jesus Christ's earthly ministry. And the fact that Jesus tells us to remain on the lookout for the abomination of desolations means that something similar is going to happen again. In Daniel chapter 12, in verse 11, we read, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days." Although it remains to be seen exactly when the 1,290 days will begin and end, these end-time events all seem to culminate at the time of the return of Jesus Christ. The point is, God's people will need to endure until these times are fulfilled. We saw earlier that the end-time king of the north is prophesied to invade Jerusalem. This will be the time when the abomination of desolation is set up, marking the beginning of the tribulation. An abomination in Hebrew means something filthy and detestable to God and to his people. Desolation means destroyed, laid waste, something so horrible it leaves one speechless. So sacrifices must again be restarted in Israel, and then a ruler will not only ban daily sacrifices, but will set up something similar to what Antiochus did, something that is an abomination to God. Whatever form that takes, it won't be subtle. It will be recognized when it happens. As the prophecies of Revelation unfold, we're told that a superpower made up of 10 kings will try and attack the armies of God. This is revealed to the Apostle John when he sees a vision of a terrifying beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. In Revelation 17, verses 12 through 14, an angel explains, "The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful." Understand what's happening here. These human kings will try and fight against Jesus Christ. They won't win. They can't win, but they're still going to try. What we have here isn't a world war where the nations of the world are fighting each other. The nations of the world are gathering together to try and fight God. But there's more going on behind the curtain. Who's controlling them? What power could be so great that it will unify the world in a war against God? Notice in Revelation chapter 13, starting in verse 1. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. This is the beast we just saw a moment ago, ruled by the 10 kings. But continue in verse 2, and you'll see the real power behind this beast. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. And so they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast, and who is able to make war with him? Who's the dragon? The book of Revelation identifies him as none other than Satan the devil, deceiver of the world and enemy of God's people. Satan the devil is the controlling influence behind this final king of the north. But how bad will this final battle be? Remember, this battle is coming at the end of a tribulation so terrible that Jesus said no flesh would be saved alive if he didn't intervene. Let's look at a prophecy from the book of Zechariah that describes this coming war. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. Why will the returning Messiah do this? Gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem? And what will happen to these armies? Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. And in that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two, from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south. Then you shall flee through my mountain valley, for the mountain valley shall reach to Azal. Yes, you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Thus the Lord my God will come, and all the saints with you. The Apostle John also saw this in vivid detail. Let's read in Revelation chapter 19, beginning in verse 11. Now I saw heaven opened, and behold a white horse, and he who sat on him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes were like a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. He had a name written that no one knew except himself. And he was clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, followed him on white horses. Now, out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should strike the nations, and he himself will rule them with a rod of iron. He himself treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. And he has on his robe and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The good news is, this battle will be the final battle at the return of Jesus Christ. Notice in verse 1, After these things I heard a loud voice of a great multitude in heaven, saying, Hallelujah! Salvation and glory and honor and power belong to the Lord our God. For true and righteous are his judgments, because he has judged the great harlot who corrupted the earth with her fornication, and he has avenged on her the blood of his servants shed by her. Again they said, Alleluia, her smoke rises up forever and ever. But the story doesn't end with the return of Jesus. That return will mark the end of the world as we know it, but it will also mark the beginning of a much better world. Under the leadership of Jesus Christ, things will be very different. The prophet Micah tells us, He shall judge between many peoples and rebuke strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. This truly will be the war that will end war. If you want to learn more about the battle at the end of this age, you can download our booklets, How to Understand Prophecy and the Book of Revelation, The Storm Before the Calm. These booklets will walk you through many of the Bible's prophecies about what will occur immediately before Jesus returns. They will provide you with many more scriptures than we had time to cover in this episode, and also basic explanations to help you make sense of these prophecies. You can also take a look at our articles, You Can Escape World War III and Armageddon, the Apocalypse, World War III, and the End of the World. These will fill in the pieces of what God has promised will occur to this earth just prior to the return of His Son and our soon-coming King. I'm Phil Sandilands. Thank you for sharing your time with me on this episode of Life, Hope, and Truth Presents. At Life, Hope, and Truth Presents, our mission is to help you discover God's plan as revealed in the Bible. If you're ready to explore further, take a look at the links in the description. Enjoyed this video? Be sure to give it a like, hit subscribe, and tap that notification bell so you'll never miss any of our content. And thanks for watching.